So is this obscure and underwhelming little bit of war gear actually a hidden gem in the Guard Codex? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today for some reason we're going to dedicate an entire video to an obscure piece of war gear, which for some reason I've felt the need to fixate on rather a lot, to the extent where I've spent a slightly disturbing amount of time mathing out the damage output of it. At least in my estimations, this rather underwhelming little bit of war gear that should be terrible actually is a kind of an auto-include on a couple of guard units. The piece of war gear itself is called the Augur Array, one of the fairly underwhelming Imperial Guard vehicle upgrades, and I must admit this video was kind of heavily inspired by a Mordian Glory one, which I'll link down in the video description below. I'm sure almost all the Guard players watching this already know Mordian Glory's channel, but if you haven't come across it yet, I'd certainly check it out. A whole ton of top-notch content for the Hammer of the Emperor. The video in question was called Is the Augur Array Still Totally Useless? And it came at about the same time as I got sent a list from a Patreon, asking me to review an Imperial Guard list, and interestingly that included Augur Arrays on just a couple of meaningful units there, and it did get me thinking as to which tanks and vehicles would actually have them viable and which ones might not. On paper, the Augur Array looks like it should be a truly terrible upgrade. It's a plus 5-point upgrade for a single reroll to hit once per game. It just seems very underwhelming indeed when often you can buy an entire extra weapon for 5 points, something that can fire turn on turn, like say a Storm Bolter or a pintle mounted heavy stubber. Usually your vehicle's going to miss something at some point in the game, so it effectively equates to one extra shot out of one powerful weapon, something like a las cannon, a demolisher cannon, or a basilisk earthshaker cannon. An extra shot, particularly hitting on 4+ a lot of the time, usually just doesn't seem like it's going to be worth it. But I found the idea interesting that you could probably roughly math out the value of one as to how much extra damage it adds on top of the unit's base cost. My rough overall take is that generally it's useless on most vehicles, but actually really could have a decent role on manticores and particularly basilisks, due to the number of shots and the way that the units work. First up, let's take a look at other vehicles though, say for example a very common pick of a Lehman Russ Demolisher Tank Commander, a very threatening unit that can pack a Demolisher Cannon and las cannon. It grants you 8 fairly accurate and high damage anti-tank shots each turn, and that'd cost you 200 points. Adding the Augur Array would take it to 205 points to give you a single hit reroll, and it's interesting that you can roughly calculate the unit's efficiency gain and the decrease in survivability for the cost. First up, in taking the Augur Array, you're basically losing survivability across the whole army. You're paying for an upgrade that adds offensive power but doesn't do anything for your defense. So if they are firing at this tank commander, they effectively get a plus 2.5% increase in their damage output. Basically for the same investment of firepower, they kill slightly more points as the tank commander costs more. Then to calculate how much extra threat you get for it, you have to roughly estimate how many turns the tank commander is going to be firing, because the Augur Array is a 1-turn upgrade. I think a pretty reasonable estimate on average for tank commanders and how many turns of effective firepower they'd get over the course of the game might be around 3 turns. On turn 1 the enemy might be either hiding or out of range, and then after that they should get a fair few turns of firepower, though of course if any tank commanders die early, that's going to bring down the average number of shooting out of them by quite a lot. I think 3 turns is relatively realistic. Some will be shooting all game, some will be out of range or killed before they get to fire that much. Assuming reroll 1s from the tank order, that equates to around about 19 hits worth of anti-tank firepower. When you miss a shot, the Augur Array will give you an extra 2/3 of a hit, so it equates to around about a 3.2% damage buff, assuming that you fire around 3 times. For me, I think that's not quite worth it enough. You're taking the minor defensive hit, and as the Augur Array costs 2.5% worth of the points cost, only going up to 3.2% extra firepower is only a tiny increase in damage output per the points cost. Overall, you lose a bit in durability and barely gain anything in terms of damage efficiency. In general, for this sort of reason, I'd say it's usually not going to be worth it on the standard vehicle, even really powerful ones with big shots like the Demolisher. Where I think the Augur Array could be really quite interesting though, is something like a Basilisk with full payload. One of these would cost you 125 points plus a command point, and if you take the Augur Array that would be going up to 130, a 4% increase in the unit's cost. The damage output works out to be a fairly decent gain in my opinion. With the 2d6 shots drop the lowest, you average around about 2.2 hits on your target every turn, and for a Basilisk I'd estimate maybe they'd get around 4 turns worth of firing. Most of the time they're going to be in the backfield and safe from enemy reprisals, though there is always the chance that in some games they're going to get taken out early maybe some enemies move their flyers over, or maybe they have a turn or two being interrupted by units getting tagged in combat. Overall, in 4 turns worth of firepower, you'd average around about 9 hits on your target, and the Augur Array allowing you to reroll one of those shots gives you an extra 0.5 hits. Compared with the unit's whole damage output, that's a 5.6% buff, an extra percentage point or so over the 4% that it cost. Again, you get the cut in durability the same with the Rus, but I think that the reason that the Augur Array is more interesting on the Basilisk is because that cut in durability just really doesn't matter all that much. Tank commanders and most vehicles have to actually get in line of sight, so they're actually going to matter with the durability stats when the enemy shoots them back, whereas generally things like Basilisks and Manticores are very happy to be sat at the back of the board. So in general for artillery, you generally want to skew things towards being as hard hitting as possible, and it doesn't really matter if they're not all that tough. That's the reason why things like Cadian mortar heavy weapon teams work. Their damage output is okay, and it doesn't matter that they die to a stiff breeze, because they're not going to be out in the open, they're going to be hiding behind terrain. Overall, essentially getting a 1.6% damage boost, not really caring too much about the durability for the vast majority of situations, and plus there's a little bit more, getting more value out of the command point and front loading your damage, which we'll get to in a second. Just before that though, I thought we'd quickly mention the Manticore. This one's kind of similar, and now at 155 points plus a command point. The Augur Array increased the cost by 3.2%, but averages you around 4% extra damage. I've assumed that you get to launch 3.5 rockets for the Manticore out of a normal game. They can only fire a maximum of 4, and at least in some games they are going to get taken out early, so you're not going to get to fire your 4 rockets in every single game. Overall, I'd say it's perhaps not as overwhelming on the Manticore as the Basilisk, mainly for the reason that you're expecting slightly more but slightly lower quality shots out of the gun. Basilisks have their firepower nice and concentrated. Again, with the Basilisk, the durability isn't as much of an issue if you do get a small cut. Hopefully they should be safe the vast majority of the time. Whenever they're not being shot, the efficiency of their durability just doesn't matter whatsoever. So overall, I'd argue that they're quite good for a small damage efficiency boost on both the Basilisk and the Manticore, but I think on top of that they do have 2 other good reasons that you might want to take them. First up, you get the advantage of front-loading your damage. Typically in 40k, you can gain some big swings by getting damage going early. If, say, that Augur Array does convert to something like a Dead Space Marine or something, it's better to do so on turn 1 of the game, when it's going to mean that your opponent's not going to be able to use that Space Marine for the other 4 turns to inflict damage and score objectives and things. And artillery is particularly good to amp up the Alpha Strike, as they can hit anything on the board. Obviously, only being a small upgrade, it doesn't really amp up the Alpha Strike absolutely loads, but it certainly would make your first turn of Basilisk shooting with multiple ones of these just that little bit more threatening. The other argument for firing it off as soon as possible is that you just really don't want your tank to die without the Augur Array used. In terms of damage efficiency, that seems like the only way that you could absolutely lose by including one. You don't really want to bring one along and just forget it all game long, or risk the tank getting blown up before you've used that extra reroll. The other argument that you could make for them above the points cost efficiency is that you're also getting a little bit more value out of command points invested as well. Full payload for 3 damage out of your Earthshakers or Manticores is a really nice upgrade. Most people seem to think that it's worth a command point if not more, as it's almost auto-include in the vast majority of competitive guard lists, and adding an Augur Array means that you get essentially 1 extra shot with that command point upgrade, and that's more valuable than a shot without it. On top of that, if you were already planning to use any big damage dealer stratagems already, things like overlapping fields of fire for Cadians, load fire reload, or perhaps that gatekeeper relic for the regular battle cannon, any of those could be good ways to get more value out of those upgrades. Morty and Glory did mention that load fire reload stratagem in his video. As it costs a command point and is limited use, if you can get just a little bit more value out of it with an Augur Array, then that 5-point upgrade might well tip it into being a lot more worth it. So now we've massively overanalyzed one niche bit of war gear within the Guard Codex. Just how much more awesome power does this add to the Guard? I must admit, in all honesty, not very much. I would argue that it is worth it, particularly on Basilisks with full payload, and if you are taking one and consider them efficient, then I'd say that in general adding an Augur Array to them will make them very slightly more so. The differences are kind of slight though. A few percentage points here or there are kind of unlikely to change games, and I can see from a practical point of view, if you're looking around to save a few points, they're probably going to be the first thing on the chopping block. In any case though, I really did just find the idea that a upgrade that I've always thought was completely useless could genuinely be kind of worth it on the upgraded artillery tanks. So anyway, hope you've enjoyed that somewhat, and thank you for humouring me with talking about a 5-point edge case upgrade in the Guard Codex. I look forward to all of this analysis being completely meaningless once the new book comes out and they do something different. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k stuff coming, with new videos just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that down in the video description below if you're interested. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.